Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your host, Luke Johnson, coming to you from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA. Coming to you today to bring you some more historical insight with this week's episode on a great invention, television. The device has a storied history, and as in most cases of most major inventions, cannot go to one person, but several people who have had hands in development of the television apparatus. And it all started with one accidental discovery. In 1872, an English telegraph worker named Joseph May realized that a wire was varying in electrical conductivity. After further investigation, May discovered that change occurred when a beam of sunlight fell onto the wire, which by chance had been placed on a table near the window. And while it was not seen as important at the time, it proved the basis for changing light into an electrical signal. Thus, the basic premise of television. And just 8 years later, a French engineer named Maurice Leblanc proposed a scanning mechanism that would take advantage of the retina's temporary but finite retainment of a visual image. He proposed a new kind of photoelectric cell that would look upon only one portion at a time of a picture to be transmitted. Starting at the upper left corner of the picture, the cell would then proceed to the right-hand side and then jump back to the left-hand side, one line lower, similar to how people read. And it would continue in this way, transmitting information on how much light was seen at each portion until the entire picture was scanned. And a receiver would be synchronized with the transmitter, reconstructing the original image line by line. However, Leblanc never constructed a working apparatus. And neither did the man who would make the next steps in television history, Paul Nipkow, the man who invented the scanning disc that would later be used in early mechanical televisions. And thus, the concept of the Nipkow disc was eventually used by two people, John Logie Baird in Great Britain and Charles Francis Jenkins in the United States, to build the world's first successful mechanical televisions. In 1922, Jenkins sent a still picture by radio waves, but the first true television success, the transition of a live human face, was achieved by John Logie Baird in 1925. The efforts of both men, however, were generally greeted with ridicule. As far back as 1880, when an article was published in the British journal Nature, it had been speculated that television was possible, but definitely not worthwhile. For one thing, the cost of building such a device would probably not be repaid because there was no way to make money out of it. And later in Scientific American, an article said that there might be some uses for television, but entertainment was not one of them. Most people thought the concept was completely ridiculous. However, persistence paid off, the work went on, and began to produce results and competitors. In 1927, AT&T gave a public demonstration of the new mechanical television, and by 1928, the General Electric Company, also known as GE, had begun regular television broadcasts. However, all of these experiments and products were mechanical. Electronic television would not come into existence until the late 1920s. And the problem with mechanical television is the image produced always comes out blurry and flickering. A Scottish electrical engineer named A. Campbell Swinton wrote that the problems can probably be solved by the employment of two beams of cathode rays instead of spinning disks. Now, for those of you who don't know, cathode rays are beams of electrons generated in a vacuum tube that are steered by magnetic fields or electric fields. And Swinton argued that they could paint a fleeting picture on the glass screen of a tube coated on the inside with a phosphorescent material. Because the rays could move at nearly the speed of light, they would avoid the flicker problem, and their tiny size would allow excellent resolution. He was basically describing an electronic television system. However, he never built such a device. Which takes us to 1923. While working for the Westinghouse Electric Company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a man named Vladimir Zworykin filed a patent application for an all-electronic television system, although he was unable to build and demonstrate it. In 1929, he convinced David Sarnoff, vice president and general manager of Westinghouse's parent company, the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, to support his research, by predicting that in 2 years, with $100,000 of funding, he could produce a workable electronic television system. Quite an electrifying idea. But little did they know, at the same time in San Francisco, California, a young man from Utah was already demonstrating his own electronic television system. The man's name? Philo T. Farnsworth. He was a young, self-educated engineer who had only had a high school education. He was a remarkable young man. And if one were to look at his background, they probably wouldn't expect him to make such an amazing contribution to the world of electronic science. He was born on August 19th, 1906, to Louis and Serena Farnsworth, a farming couple in a small log cabin built by his father. In 1918, when he was 12 years old, Farnsworth family moved from Utah to Idaho on a farm his father had purchased. And young Philo Farnsworth was ecstatic when he learned that the house was wired for electricity. An avid reader of science magazines, he was absolutely amazed by electricity. And while on the farm, he soon showed electrical prowess. He had found a burned out electric motor along some other items that were discarded by the previous owners on the farm, and was able to rewind the armature. He also converted his mother's hand-powered washing machine into an electric-powered washing machine. And he also made repairs to the family's electric generator when it broke down. And it was while reading one of his science magazines that inspiration would strike once again. While reading one of his science magazines, Farnsworth came upon an article about the new television device, and was convinced that the scanning system that used an electronic disc would be too slow. Only an electronic system would be able to scan and assemble an image fast enough. But the question on his mind was to how to develop such a device. And soon, the question would be answered by performing a task that most people would not find very inspiring. One day, while looking out his bedroom, 14-year-old Farnsworth saw a field being plowed, or he might have been plowing the field himself. It's not exactly clear. But what he saw in the field were the little lines cut in the earth and the back and forth motion that was done to create them. He wondered if the earth could be split into little lines. Could you perhaps do the same thing with an image? And then could the image be shown on a screen? And so in 1922 he began making sketches for a device that would later become the electronic television. He often met with his science teacher to sketch out drawings for his device on the blackboard, which often took up the entire blackboard and several other blackboards. Interestingly, it was one of these sketches that would later come back up in a court case against Philo Farnsworth and RCA, but more on that later. And so in 1926 he moved with his wife to California to begin work on his new device. He was able to procure funds for building his device by speaking to two charity owners, and they put up the funds for him. But his hard work paid off, and on September 7th, 1927, Farnsworth's new electronic television transmitted its first image, a simple straight line, to a receiver in another room of his laboratory at 202 Green Street in San Francisco, California. However, the celebration was short-lived, as soon Farnsworth would put others into hot water. Farnsworth soon found himself head-to-head with RCA. The vice president of RCA at that time, David Sarnoff, had offered Philo Farnsworth $100,000 for the rights to his television system. Farnsworth turned them down, however, and this must have really gotten on Sarnoff's nerves, because he and his company, RCA, did everything in their power to discredit Philo Farnsworth. And they eventually, in 1930, Vladimir Zworykin visited Farnsworth's laboratory. One can only imagine what his motives were, but I'll leave that up to you people. He discovered that his receiver, the iconoscope as he called it, was superior to Farnsworth's receiver. However, Farnsworth's image dissector tube was superior to his own transmitter. And so began a long court battle that began in 1932. Several of Farnsworth's original drawings on chalkboards were brought into investigation by RCA, claiming that he copied Zworykin's ideas. These were later proved to be false, and Zworykin made a horrible statement when he said that he claimed, while at Farnsworth's laboratory, he claimed that he wished he had thought of the idea. Farnsworth accused Zworykin of stealing his patent ideas, and vice versa. And this probably all stemmed from when Farnsworth sold the rights to his television system to RCA's main competitor, Philco. The legal battle lasted 7 years until finally, in 1939, the court ruled in Farnsworth's favor. RCA had to pay royalties to Philo Farnsworth. The stress of the entire case took a great toll on Philo Farnsworth, and in 1939 he suffered a nervous breakdown and moved to Maine. In 1947 he moved to Indiana, where he began his own television company, Farnsworth Television. They manufactured their first television set in 1947. However, the company was still in deep financial trouble, and in 1949 the company was taken over by International Telegraph and Telephone Company, or IT&T for short. That same year, the company was reorganized as Capehart Farnsworth, and Farnsworth remained vice president of research, and the company produced televisions until 1965, but sad to say, it was a rather small player compared to Farnsworth's longtime rival, RCA. Well, folks, that about wraps up our program for today. And until next week, I'm Luke Johnson. This has been Bowtie Talks. Goodbye, and God bless.